So I'm going to talk about the concept of survivorship bias as it relates to architecture and why the modernist argument about it is actually complete bullshit. Now, for those who don't know, survivorship bias is essentially a theory that people tend to overvalue old things and think that old things work better. And that's simply because the old things that are still around are the ones that survived, whereas the old things that aren't still around are the ones that failed. So for instance, the idea that an old plane works better than a new plane, old planes work better than new planes, or old cars work better than new cars. It's because the ones that are still around of the old ones are the better ones, whereas the ones that were crap aren't still around. Whereas with the new ones, you have both. Now, there's some validity to this theory in many areas, but I'm going to explain why it's bullshit in terms of architecture. Now, survivorship bias is used as an argument both against the idea that traditional architecture is more sturdy and better lasting, but also and more practical in general, but also against the argument that traditional architecture is more beautiful. Now, the reason why this is bullshit is simply because we have, number one, we have records of history, images, photographs, paintings that show what places looked like back then. And the fact is, there weren't a bunch of hideous buildings everywhere like the modernist crap we have today. There weren't a bunch of hideous buildings depicted in these images that existed back then but didn't survive. Not only that, but we have entire cities and towns, and especially in certain parts of Southern Europe, where you have entire villages, entire towns, entire cities that are more or less still preserved the way they were from centuries ago. So if there were a bunch of ugly buildings, my question is, why aren't any of them at all still there, especially when you have cases where entire cities, towns, and villages are virtually almost entirely still intact in the same form they were hundreds of years ago, like in countries like Italy, for instance. So right there, I'm going to call complete bullshit on it. And it's yeah, even when you have historic buildings that are dilapidated, I would argue that they still have a certain beauty that modernist buildings don't. And you could easily renovate those buildings to look beautiful by giving them a fresh coat of paint. Whereas in the case of modernist buildings, trying to make them beautiful is like putting lipstick on a pig. It's like spraying deodorant onto a pile of shit. It just doesn't work. So that's one point right there. Another is that, again, in terms of sturdiness, you have entire villages and towns and cities that have stood the test of time. So this idea that it's only the homes of the rich, of the elite. It's but that's not true, because you have these towns and villages in countries like Italy and Spain and Portugal where the commoner buildings are still around, not just the mansions, the palaces, and yet they're still beautiful. They're still holding strong. So again, it's just complete bullshit. And their argument is yeah, but what about the shacks? It's okay, maybe there were shacks back then that weren't beautiful, but the actual buildings that were intended to be permanent generally were. It's very difficult to find an ugly building, a genuinely ugly building from before the 20th century. It's very difficult. It's even from the early 20th century, there are some ugly buildings from the early 20th century, but again, nowhere near as many as after World War II. And it's a testament to these old buildings that even when they're dilapidated, they're still more beautiful than modernist buildings in pristine condition. But as I said, again, you could fix the dilapidation issue easily. You can't fix something that's just fundamentally hideous. So that's another reason. And also the fact is, let's say hypothetically, even if they were right, and there was a mix of beautiful buildings and ugly buildings from back then, okay, where's the beautiful buildings being built now? Because all I see are ugly buildings. Literally all the new constructions are just hideous shit. Well, probably 99%, I would say, are either hideous or just bland and uninspired and tacky. Very few new buildings are being built. And when I say new buildings, I'm not counting reconstructions of previous buildings that were in the same exact spot, like some of the reconstructions in Europe of buildings that were destroyed in World War II, which are kind of, some of them turn out better than others, but I'm not counting those. I'm talking about entirely new buildings. How many do we see that are genuinely beautiful? Very few. So right there, it's like, okay, even if you granted the premise that there are ugly buildings that didn't survive from back then, there are still so many beautiful buildings from back then and so few from now that it's clear that the overall average is lower now, especially considering that the overall population was much lower back then. So the total number of buildings being built would have been much lower. But as I said, it is bullshit because we have entire cities, towns, and villages from those eras that are still basically 100% intact, and there's no ugly buildings to be found there. So what gives? Now, I do want to say, though, the argument of survivorship bias, it's bullshit when it comes to art and architecture, but it does have some merit. Well, art, like visual art, like it's probably bullshit when it comes to visual art. Actually, I'm not 100% sure on that one. I'm guessing it's probably bullshit on that too. It's possible there were shitty painters from back then whose works didn't survive entirely, but I'm still skeptical on that one because, again, I would say, well, there's plenty of evidence of beautiful paintings and sculptures from back then. Very few from today. One area, though, where I do think survivorship bias has some merit, and it's going to hurt a lot of people to hear this, is frankly, like movies and TV shows. I do think a lot of the nostalgia bros who are really obsessed with like, oh, everything was better back in the 80s, the 90s, the 70s, whatever. A lot of them are remembering things with rose-colored glasses, and they do forget the shitty ones. They forget the movies like Speed 2 or Lost in Space or Batman and Robin or Gremlins 2 or Back to the Future Part 3, like the movies that were kind of like either mediocre or shitty or disappointing, and they only remember the good ones. Like, I will grant that that's an actual example of survivorship bias, and there are other examples of it, but when it comes to architecture, I'm sorry, no. Like, there's just way too much counter evidence to suggest that it's not like, oh, architecture has been equally beautiful, equally functional and practical throughout all the ages. It's just that only the better ones are around now. Now, granted, there have been innovations in the last, like air conditioning, for instance, but again, there's no reason that we couldn't build new buildings that combine air conditioning and stuff like that with the innovations of not the past innovations of traditional architecture. Not to mention, in many cases, the old buildings themselves can be retrofitted. And people are like, yeah, that's expensive. It's like, yes, but is it more expensive than like the gazillions of dollars that gets put into new developments and new buildings, entirely new stuff? Like, what is actually cheaper in the long run? Like retrofitting an old building with air conditioning and stuff like that, or building an entirely new one? And again, regardless, it's like, regardless of the economics of it, I just think the bottom line is like, it's better to live in a place that doesn't look like shit. It's better to live in a place with beautiful buildings than with ugly buildings. That's just generally true. So yeah, those are my thoughts on survivorship bias as it relates to architecture.